Okay, welcome to video 2 on chapter 12. We're going to cover some types of installations here. Um, Clean install, the in-place upgrade, and dual boot. You must perform a clean install if you have a new blank hard drive. If you already have a Windows operating system installed, you then have three options of installing. Option 1 is a clean install. Another term for a clean install is a custom installation, and basically you're going to wipe out the existing operating system and install a new one. Option 2 is an in-place upgrade. An in-place upgrade will keep your user settings and all your installed applications and just upgrade the Windows. Option 3 is a multi-boot. This option allows you to run two instances of Windows or instance of Linux or some other operating system in Windows. They can be the same or different versions. For example, you could have a multi-boot system that runs two instances of Windows 10, or you can have it where you're running one Windows 8 and the other instance is Windows 10. And we'll get into doing a multi-boot as well as the clean install. Other tips to keep in mind, right? Let's see here. Is that you cannot upgrade from a 32-bit to a 64-bit or a 64-bit to a 32-bit. If you want a 64-bit version of Windows and you have an existing 32-bit version, you'll need to do a multi-boot system or erase the old version and perform a clean install of the new version, because you can't upgrade to 64-bit from 32 bits, and you can't downgrade from a 64-bit to 32-bit. All right. So we're making some choices here, right? You do not need to allocate all the drive space to the Windows partition. If you plan to do a multi-boot system, you might want to split the drive into two partitions, with half going to Windows and the other half going to your second OS in the multi-boot. Some users prefer to have more than one partition to help organize their data on their hard drives. If this is the case, I would recommend purchasing a second hard drive, though, as partitioning the Windows drive with less space can cause more issues than the benefit of organizing the data is worth. You can organize your data using folders just as easily as separate partitions, and it's much easier to resolve issues if you start running out of space, as it's very easy to install a second hard drive and move a folder versus moving all the data from the partition, deleting that partition, then expanding the partition with Windows. While it can be done, but as I said, it's just so much easier just moving a single folder or folders to a new drive than trying to manipulate partitions because you're running out of space. So while you can allocate less space to the Windows partition, it's usually not very recommended unless there's an absolute real critical need. But for most organizations, you will likely join the systems to a Windows domain. If you do that, you'll need an account on the domain that has the rights and permissions that allow you to join a computer to the domain. And then the users will need an account that allows them access to the computer. The computers we use at TCC are part of a domain. Being part of a domain allows any student to log into any computer as they have an account on the domain, and thus can log into any of the domain computers. It makes it so much easier to manage, centrally manage user accounts, and manage access with the domain, and we'll get into that as well. Before we start installing Windows, we'll want to run through the following checklist. Does the system meet our minimum or recommended hardware requirements? Do we have all the device drivers that we will need? Do we have all the software we will need? Any applications, anything that we're going to install? And to become activated, Windows will require a product license key. Do you have the key available when you install it? It's just more beneficial when you have it at the time of installation. You can put it in right then, but you can activate it after the fact, and we'll do that as well to show you how the activation works. But we'll do both with the key, and then later after the fact we'll activate Windows. How will the system be accessed by network users, right? There's different options, and you have all the required information to set up the system onto the network, and we'll go over those in detail here. And how will the system be set up on the network? Will it get a dynamic IP from a DHCP server? Or will the address be manually entered as a static IP address? And we'll go over that in more detail later in the semester. Are we doing a clean install or an upgrade? If a clean install, will this be a dual boot system? Do you have all your important data backed up and know where it's located, right? So once again, you need to verify you have all the software required. Your Windows installation software, any device drivers, any applications you need. If you have existing data, you'll need to make sure you have it backed up, especially all your important data that you would not want to lose. If there is existing data and you will not be reformatting the drive, run antivirus to ensure the drive is free from malware and viruses. Verify the boot sequence is correct, so the system will boot from the installation media, right? If you got the installation files on a USB drive, you need to be able to make sure that it's going to boot off the USB drive. We'll go over that in detail. Disable any boot protections in the UEFI so that the installation can modify the boot area of the drive. And then ensure you are in the proper firmware mode, UEFI or UEFI CSM. Most of the time it'll just be in UEFI. It should be very rare that you need to run the CSM mode. And if you're installing on a laptop, make sure to plug in the power adapter so the system does not run out of power during the middle of the installation. That's the last thing anyone needs. Here. And then ensure you have the product key. This slide tells you where all those product keys could be found, depending on how you purchased your Windows. This is showing the location, right? And in some organizations, you have a Microsoft activation server that will allow you to activate your Windows installation instead of entering the key manually. And this is just showing how the system will look if it were registered by an activation server. Then the installation software will typically be found in an ISO file. An ISO is just a file that is equivalent to an optical disc, like a DVD. It's an image that includes the file system and all the files and folders that are needed. And an ISO can be called an ISO image, or even a disk image. And we'll mess around with the ISO files when we install our VMs and you'll get to see how they work. And you can unpack an ISO by right-clicking the ISO file and then selecting Mount. This will unpack the image and create a virtual drive, including a drive letter that you can access and look through all the files, make changes. and then using some software you can recreate the ISO. You can then go through the image files and folders while it's unpacked, right? You can easily burn the ISO to a DVD if you have a large enough DVD, and then we'll definitely use ISOs as a virtual DVD to install Windows and Linux onto our virtual machines during our labs. So now we're going to actually install Windows. So this ends our part 2 of the installation chapter, and then we'll pick up in part 3 where we'll actually do some of the lab installs.